Hello, this is Mr. Ferreira, and this is the second part of the Features of Science video. The previous video we ended with this slide on theory construction, having discussed the Popper concept of falsifiability, this idea that any good objective science or feature of science should require us to be able to falsify something, to be able to disprove something. And so for us, what we need to look at in terms of this, we need to kind of expect that another feature of science is theory construction, because we do have need for theories, because theories inform our knowledge in terms of our writing, in terms of essays. And we see that a theory is a general model, it says here, that explains observations and facts. And that's kind of why it's important for us to have evaluation points that says there's alternate explanations, because it's effectively saying that there's another model that can explain the observations that we found, and therefore limiting our understanding of the model. So therefore the model is false. We see also here it says that facts are meaningless, and that all we can do is validate facts through our understanding of research methods. And we also see that theories do help us understand or predict phenomena around us, which ends up being really important to us. And of course, theory construction is not something which is just defined to science. It's something which we potentially may do every single day. So think about the things that you might theorize about: how to make a better cup of tea, how to load the dishwasher, or how to do something along those lines. We all kind of have ideas, and how can we go about to actually test this and kind of make it something which is knowledgeable that other people can use. And so what we need to be able to kind of consider is that within psychology, we're going to kind of formulate theories in a means of attempting kind of human behavior. And in order to do this, we need to have a testable theory. And we find that theories and hypothesis testing become really quite important to us. We also see from this that consulting previous research becomes important as well. And we wouldn't kind of consider moving into a theory unless we kind of knew what came beforehand. And then it says, once we have constructed a theory, we need to rigorously test it, okay? And part of that process is going to be your hypothesis testing, which happens to be the next feature of science. And with hypotheses, something which we've spent time with you trying to get you to kind of see the relationship between how we manipulate the IV and calculate the DV, that we can come up with some form of hypothesis in order to help us understand what the expected outcomes will be of a particular scientific experiment. So we say we modify theories through the process of hypothesis testing. So we can't have our theory unless we've done this hypothesis testing. Then it says a good theory must be able to generate these testable expectations. So a hypothesis is a testable expectation in order for us to kind of understand kind of how we need to kind of figure things out. So taking this particular topic kind of further, I want to explore these ideas. And so I'm going to ask a kind of a big question. What is your approach to research? In other words, if you had to try and figure out how do you make your little theory, how do you make a general knowledge? And I'm going to explore this. Now, this isn't kind of a novel way to look at it. There's no real answers to it. And I was clearly watching Forrest Gump while I was thinking about this. And so, of course, there's that famous saying from Forrest Gump that says, life is like a box of chocolates. But I'm saying that your scientific research is like a puzzle. Now, of course, this is quite a difficult puzzle that you might be able to see, and could demonstrate potentially how many people do solve puzzles in terms of trying to construct the edge, potentially isolate certain parts of the puzzle and try and put those things together. But what's really important here is that whenever you build a puzzle, you can only really focus on the individual piece and kind of see where that piece fits in. And it may be that you try multiple different places. And so what I'm ultimately saying is that maybe solving a puzzle is a bit like the inductive process. It says here, we reason from the particular to the general. What I mean by that is that that small piece of information, that piece of puzzle in front of us, ultimately trying to figure out how to see what the big picture is. And that's what induction is. And so therefore you could go back to that question about the teacher who is got opinion. You could say, well, she could have used an inductive process, trying to figure out kind of small aspects of the children's eating behavior in order to formulate the bigger theory about kind of nutrition and reading and behavior. And so we see that Newton is a classic example of this particular inductive process where he kind of sits under a tree and an apple drops on his head. And we see actually there's always an observation that happens in this particular context. And so we must wait for the observation. But of course, it's this process here that defines the inductive process, where we kind of keep on going up and down in order to finally draw conclusions, test things again, and then at the end, we propose the theory, and we see that kind of Newton's a good example of this, because he kind of runs lots of different experiments, and he times things and he weighs things and things like that, and ultimately proposes the theory of gravity. So that's the inductive process. The second type of process is maybe viewing scientific research like a complex picture. So it's kind of hard to tell exactly what a complex picture is. So this is from a game, What You See. Okay, so this particular game, you're presented with a picture. And so this is a complex picture. There's a lot of different things happening here. But what is also important is that nothing is obscured, nothing is hidden from you. You can see absolutely everything. But we then have to zoom in to kind of something specific, like these two M's. Okay, so the point of this puzzle was to try and solve each of the different bands that you can see in this picture. So two M's together like that is quite clearly M and M. Okay, so you got the big picture in front of you, you'd have to focus on something smaller and try and make sense of it. And you see actually there's a whole kind of range of things that you might find in this particular, some which are easy to spot, some are a little bit kind of more complex. So this athlete is actually the band athlete, but this particular part of the picture here is girls allowed, because those are female toilets and there's a tick on it, so girls are allowed there. And so what we have is deductive reasoning, where we reason from the general to the particular. So the general is that we have the big picture in front of us. It's a picture of a festival, but then we find the particular, and we say sometimes that Darwin was a bit like this. So Darwin, once again, starts with observations, but he proposes the theory right in the beginning, and he then goes about testing his theory by finding samples of different animals that potentially fit into his theory of evolution, and finally drawing conclusions from that particular research. The two videos that are associated with this, obviously you can have a look at them, search them on YouTube, and you'll see that they do definitely explain both deduction and induction. Now, that could go back to our original question, well, how would you approach research? Would you use an inductive process or a deductive process? Are you more like solving a puzzle, or are you more like understanding a complex picture? Now, of course, this is scientific reasoning. Do psychologists fit into this? Well, it's kind of harder to say. I'd say Freud potentially used a deductive reasoning process, kind of knowing about his theory of the mind and then finding examples to kind of help him kind of explain it. Or it could just be that, once again, going back to our objectivity, that we are a little bit different to everyone else. And of course, we're looking for nuts in our research. So that was your hypothesis testing. And so the very last thing we need to look at is paradigms and paradigm shifts, because ultimately it becomes important to us to know that science, even though it has all these features of science, is not always as clear cut as we would like it to be. And Thomas Kuhn here suggested that science as a discipline itself has a shared set of assumptions. So a paradigm is a shared set of assumptions, and we see clearly, like Newtonian physics as an example of kind of all these different laws that we have in order to understand it. The reason this is relevant to us is that he said that the social sciences weren't really sciences because we didn't have this shared set of assumptions. And so we don't share that common kind of ancestor of the core sciences or the natural sciences. Now, what Kuhn and people may argue is that we have internal disagreement because we have different approaches. We have the behavioral approach and psychodynamic approach and the cognitive approach and biological approach and all these different ways to understand things. And so perhaps Kuhn is right in that maybe this whole features of science is not relevant to us in psychology because we aren't really a science. And so going back to, well, what then does make science? Kuhn would say that what we have is this shared set of agreement that ultimately progresses quite slowly, and that because people kind of agree with each other, but occasionally we have this thing called a paradigm shift. And this is what he calls a revolution within science, is when the rules that we perhaps need to use to understand science need to be broken because we can't explain everything. And the example of this is how Newtonian physics, after a while, was unable to answer all the questions that scientists were having about the wave and particle nature of light. And so ultimately there's a rejection of all those rules, and we had this new Einsteinian theory that kind of, and that's your paradigm shift, and we rewrite the rules. And maybe that's the key to psychology. We never have those rewriting of the rules. We just have different approaches. And unlike physics, where they move from one paradigm to the next, we kind of keep paradigms, and there's still people today who practice behavioralism or psychodynamic approach or kind of ideas like that. But not everyone agrees with Kuhn and science, and certainly paradigm shifts are an important aspect of science. But there is not always agreement within science, and certainly psychology is perhaps one of those ideas where we ultimately are trying to find out about human behavior, but we are happy to accept different explanations, and therefore we do potentially have different paradigms, but they're just not seen in the same way as what kind of the natural sciences are. And this, to kind of end with, is kind of a statement that even says that proper science in itself is problematic, because many scientists, for example, says most sciences are characterized by internal conflict, dispute, and refusal to accept new ideas. And this becomes important, especially when we move on to our next topic of peer review, where we consider this idea that how do we kind of review the work, the research that we've done in order to understand it. So there we go. That's another short video, hopefully, on the features of science. My recommendation to you is to perhaps kind of set about this as a content where you kind of write down a couple of paragraphs where you understand the 7 different things that I've kind of mentioned and see how they fit together, and look at some of the practical questions that you might find. This is important for us to not kind of ignore this, because of course those 5 or 6 mark questions may well be the difference between getting the grade we want and not getting it. So there we go. Thank you so much. This is the end of the video for now, and I'll continue the features of science in the next